The mid-August sun hung heavy over the brick and asphalt streets of Cleveland, baking the historic avenues until the air shimmered in a relentless, humid haze. It was a suffocating afternoon, the kind that sent tourists retreating into the air-conditioned sanctuary of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, while locals moved with a lethargic determination, seeking the shade of the sparse trees lining the sidewalks. For Maya Diaz, a petite woman in her early 20s with coffee-brown eyes and hair pulled back in a tight bun, the heat was just another part of the job. Maya worked for the city's sanitation department, a role that rendered her invisible to the bustling crowds of businessmen and shoppers. But she took a quiet pride in her work, wearing her neon yellow safety vest over her gray uniform with a sense of dignity. Growing up in the foster care system, shuffled from one home to another that was indifferent at best, had taught her that the world owed her nothing, and survival was a daily task to be met without complaint. She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a gloved hand, pausing to sweep a discarded coffee cup into her wheeled bin near the warehouse district, where the contrast between pristine luxury lofts and the raw reality of street refuse was starkest. It was in this moment of mundane labor that a small miracle, or perhaps a small tragedy, caught her eye. From the shadow of a parked delivery truck, a puppy emerged, looking disoriented and terrified. It was a German shepherd, no more than a few months old, with oversized paws and ears that hadn't quite decided to stand erect, its fur matted with grime. The puppy whimpered, a thin sound that cut through the city's drone, and took a hesitant step from the curb onto the scorching asphalt of the busy street. Maya froze, her heart seizing in her chest as she recognized the danger before her mind could fully process the scene. The roar of an engine shattered the afternoon's languor, a sound so aggressive it seemed to vibrate in the bones of anyone nearby. A cherry-red sports car, low-slung and gleaming like a fresh wound, tore around the corner, ignoring the speed limit and the logic of driving on a crowded city street. Behind the wheel was Caleb Vance, a young man whose face was a map of privilege and indulgence, with slicked-back blonde hair and a jawline that suggested he'd never heard the word no in his life. He was laughing, head thrown back, his eyes glassy and unfocused from a midday cocktail of expensive bourbon and illicit substances. The thumping bass from his car's stereo drowned out the world beyond his leather-upholstered bubble. His friends, two other young men in similarly arrogant livery of designer polos and sunglasses, were cheering him on from the passenger seats. Maya saw the car. She saw the puppy. The puppy had frozen in the middle of the lane, its small body trembling as the red beast bore down on it. There was no time to calculate. It was pure instinct, a synaptic flash that launched her forward. Dropping her broom, Maya sprinted, her work boots pounding on the hot asphalt. She threw herself into the air, a desperate, horizontal dive. Her arms wrapped around the dog's small, trembling form, and she curled her spine, pulling her knees to her chest, making a human shield around the animal just as the screech of high-performance tires assaulted the air. The smell of burning rubber, acrid and suffocating, filled her nostrils. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for an impact that would shatter her. But the impact never came. Instead, the world jerked to a stop. The sports car's front bumper had halted. Inches from her spine, the heat from the grill was a palpable thing, almost scorching the fabric of her uniform. For a heartbeat, the street was utterly silent. Maya lay on the hot pavement, gasping for air, her arms clutched tightly around the puppy, which was whining softly against her chest. Then the silence broke. The driver's side door of the sports car flew open and Caleb Vance staggered out. He didn't rush to check if he'd just killed someone. Instead, his face was flushed with a terrifying rage, his expensive loafers slipping slightly on the pavement as he advanced on the woman lying in front of his car. "You idiot!" Caleb screamed, his voice cracking with entitlement and intoxication. "You stupid, trash picker moron! Look what you did!" He pointed wildly at the front of his pristine car, where there was absolutely no damage. But in his chemically induced delusion, he saw a catastrophic injury. Maya tried to sit up, holding the puppy protectively. But before she could get her feet under her, Caleb lunged. He kicked out. Not a warning tap, but a vicious, toe-first strike aimed at her hip. Maya cried out, curling tighter around the dog. "Get up!" Caleb shrieked, kicking her again, this time connecting with her shoulder. "You ran into my car. I saw you. You're trying to scam me for money." His friends had now spilled out of the car, laughing nervously at first, and then joining the verbal assault. One of them, a wiry kid with a mean smirk named Chad, nudged Maya with the toe of his boat shoe. Sasha didn't fight back. She couldn't, not without letting go of the puppy. And she knew with a blood-chilling certainty that if she let go, they would hurt the dog. So she endured, biting her lip until she tasted blood. But the universe has a way of balancing the scales. Walking on the adjacent sidewalk was Jack Corrigan. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained the fabric of a simple gray t-shirt and arms corded with the kind of muscle earned through years of heavy lifting in harsh environments. He had short dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the permanent vigilance in his slate gray eyes and a small, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. Jack was a Navy SEAL on leave, moving with the fluid grace of a predator, silent and efficient. He saw the woman dive. He saw the rich young men surround her. Jack didn't run. He simply altered his trajectory, moving from the sidewalk into the street with an unnerving smoothness. His expression went cold, a mask of professional disinterest that was more frightening than any shout. He reached the group just as Caleb was drawing his leg back for another kick. Jack stepped between them, his movement as fast as a blink. He caught Caleb's leg in mid-air, his hand a steel clamp around the young man's ankle. With a simple turn of his hips and what looked like an effortless push, Jack sent Caleb spinning backward. The rich boy landed in a heap on the asphalt, his sunglasses flying off his face. "Hey man, what's your problem?" Chad shouted, stepping forward. He reached out to shove Jack, a mistake he would instantly regret. Jack didn't even flinch. He seized the kid's wrist and applied a pressure point lock that sent the would-be attacker to his knees with a strangled yelp of pain. The third friend looked at Jack's face and backed away, his hands raised. Caleb scrambled to his feet, his face purple. "Do you have any idea who I am?" He sputtered. "My father owns this city. I will bury you." Jack took one step toward him. "Go," Jack said. His voice was low, like distant thunder. "Get in your car and go before I decide to stop being polite." Caleb looked into Jack's eyes and saw an abyss. Swallowing hard, he motioned to his friends, and they scrambled back into the red sports car, which tore off, leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. Jack turned his attention to the ground. The cold warrior vanished, replaced by a man of quiet concern. He knelt. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softening. Maya slowly uncurled, looking up at him through a haze of pain. She saw a hand offered to her, calloused but steady. She nodded silently, clutching the puppy. Jack helped her to her feet, his touch careful. "You did a brave thing," he said, a rare warmth touching his eyes. "A very brave thing." The fluorescent lights of the Metro Health Medical Center emergency room waiting area buzzed with a headache-inducing hum, seeming to amplify the smell of antiseptic and old coffee. It was a chaotic purgatory where the city's injured and forgotten gathered on plastic chairs. But for Maya Diaz, it was the first time in hours she had stopped moving. She sat huddled in a corner of the waiting room, her neon safety vest stark and out of place against the muted beige walls, her arms still wrapped tightly around the German Shepherd puppy. The dog, exhausted and bruised from its ordeal, had finally stopped trembling and was resting its heavy head on Maya's knee, its big brown eyes tracking every movement in the room. Maya winced as she shifted her position, a sharp pain radiating from the hip where Caleb's shoe had connected, but she didn't complain. Her focus was entirely on the small creature in her lap. A nurse named Maria, a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, had bent the rules to let the puppy stay, moved by the sight of the young woman's desperate, protective embrace. Maria had provided a clean towel and a bowl of water, whispering that as long as the dog stayed quiet, she'd look the other way on calling animal control. Jack Corrigan returned from the vending machine, his movements fluid and silent despite his size. He carried 2 bottles of water and a small packet of antiseptic wipes he'd procured from a triage nurse. He sat down next to Maya, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough to offer a sense of physical security. "Drink this," he said softly, twisting the cap off a water bottle and handing it to her. "You're running on adrenaline, and when it wears off, you'll need to be hydrated." Maya took the bottle with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "for everything. You don't have to stay." Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the packet of wipes and knelt in front of the puppy. With hands trained to dismantle weapons and neutralize enemies, he began to clean a scrape on the puppy's flank. His touch was incredibly gentle, his large fingers moving with surgical precision to avoid causing the animal pain. The puppy whimpered softly, but under Jack's calm ministration, it settled, sensing the safety that radiated from him. "I'm not going anywhere," Jack said finally, his eyes on his work. "You took a beating for a stray dog, Maya. Most people wouldn't jump in front of a car for their own relatives. I've seen brave men freeze in situations far less dangerous than that." He looked up, his slate gray eyes meeting hers. "You have the heart of a fighter. I respect that." Maya felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the oppressive summer heat. For a girl who had spent her life being invisible, to be seen, truly seen, by a man like this, was overwhelming. The quiet intimacy of the moment was broken by the sound of heavy footsteps on the linoleum floor. 2 police officers entered the waiting room, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. The lead officer, whose name tag read Russo, was a middle-aged man with a gut that strained the buttons of his uniform and a face that had settled into the permanent creases of cynicism. He looked like a man who had seen too much of the city's ugliness, and had decided that caring was too much effort. He swept the room with his eyes, his gaze landing on Maya's safety vest with a hint of distaste before he approached, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Maya Diaz?" Officer Russo asked, his voice flat and tired. Maya nodded, trying to sit up straighter. "Yes, sir." Russo clicked his pen, not making eye contact. "We got a call about a disturbance involving a vehicle and a pedestrian." "Start from the beginning." Maya recounted the events, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She described the speeding red sports car, the puppy wandering into the street, her dive to save it, and the assault that followed. She spoke of the kicks, the insults, and the smell of alcohol on the driver's breath. Russo took notes listlessly until Maya mentioned the driver's name. "He was screaming that his name was Caleb Vance," she said, "and that his father owned the city." Officer Russo's pen stopped moving. The disinterest vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden wariness. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he reassessed Maya, this time with a calculated scrutiny. "Vance," Russo repeated, the name tasting heavy in his mouth. "You sure about that name?" "Yes," Maya affirmed. "He was driving a red convertible. He was drunk." Russo slowly closed his notebook, a sigh escaping his lips that sounded like air leaving a tire. He hooked his thumbs in his duty belt, his posture shifting from bored to imposing. "Look, Ms. Diaz," Russo began, his tone condescending, the kind one uses with a slow child. "Those are serious accusations, DUI, assault. Especially against a family like the Vances. They're prominent members of this community." He paused, tilting his head. "Are you sure you didn't just misjudge the speed? Maybe you stepped into the road without looking. It happens. Sun's in your eyes. You're tired from working in the heat. Maybe the driver was just upset you scratched his expensive car." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He was twisting the narrative, planting seeds of doubt before an investigation had even begun. Maya stared at him, stunned. "He kicked me," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "He was going to kill this dog. He was drunk." Russo shrugged, a gesture of feigned helplessness. "Did you see a breathalyzer test?" "No. It's your word against his. And frankly, jumping into the street is a crime, Ms. Diaz. It's called reckless endangerment. If we pursue this, you could be the one facing fines for disrupting traffic and property damage." Maya felt tears of frustration welling in her eyes. It was happening again. The weight of a system that favored the powerful was pressing down on her. But before she could speak, a shadow fell over Officer Russo. Jack Corrigan had stood up. He hadn't rushed. He had simply unfolded to his full height until he towered over the police officer. The air in the waiting room seemed to condense around him. Jack's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes burned with a cold, controlled fire. "Officer," Jack said, his voice a low blade that cut through the hospital noise. "You seem to be confused about how an investigation works." Russo bristled, taking a half step back, his hand instinctively drifting toward his belt. "And who are you?" he demanded, trying to reclaim his authority. "I'm the witness," Jack replied calmly. "And I'm the one who stopped your prominent community member from beating a woman while she was on the ground." Russo scoffed. "Just another bystander, huh? Look, pal. Let the police handle this." Jack reached into his back pocket and produced a leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a military ID card bearing the insignia of the United States Navy. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Jack Corrigan, United States Navy SEALs," he stated, his voice devoid of arrogance, but heavy with the weight of federal authority. "I'm on active duty. I am trained in observation and reporting in high-stress environments, and my visual assessment is considered expert testimony in a court of law." Russo's eyes widened as he looked at the ID, then up at Jack's face, seeing the scar and the unmistakable hardness of a man who had seen real combat. The officer's complexion paled slightly. "I saw Caleb Vance exit his vehicle," Jack continued, stepping closer, forcing Russo to look up at him. "I observed clear signs of intoxication, slurred speech, impaired motor function, and erratic, aggressive behavior. I witnessed him commit unprovoked assault on Ms. Diaz, and I am now witnessing a law enforcement officer attempting to coerce a victim into retracting her statement." Jack leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that only Russo could hear. "If you bury this report, officer, or if you try to twist the facts to protect some rich kid, I will personally escalate this to the JAG Corps and the state police. I will make it my mission to ensure your superiors know exactly how you conduct yourself. Are we clear?" Officer Russo swallowed hard. The swagger of local authority crumbled against the undeniable hierarchy of the situation. He was used to bullying civilians, not confronting special operators who knew the law and had the clout to make noise. He cleared his throat, adjusting his belt nervously.
I was just trying to get the facts straight, sir," Russo stammered, backing away.
"Standard procedure. We have to look at all the angles." He shot Maya one last, venomous look before turning back to Jack. "We'll file the report as stated, but don't expect a miracle. It's still he said, she said situation." With that, Russo turned and walked away, motioning for his partner to follow. He didn't look back, but the set of his shoulders suggested a retreat that was purely strategic, not a surrender. He would file the report, but he would also be making a phone call to unleash the Vance family's lawyers. Jack watched him go until the automatic doors slid shut, his jaw set in a grim line. He turned back to Maya, the mask dropping to reveal his concern once more. "Ideally, that scared him straight," Jack said quietly, sitting down. "But realistically, I just poked a hornet's nest. We need to get you patched up and get you out of here." The sunrise over Cleveland brought no warmth for Maya Diaz, only a cold, creeping dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. She arrived at the sanitation department depot at 6 a.m., her body aching from the previous day's assault, her uniform pressed and cleaned despite the blooming bruises on her ribs. She clocked in, ready to lose herself in the rhythm of work. But before she could get to her cart, the depot supervisor called her name. Frank Miller was a man who normally avoided eye contact, a perpetually worried civil servant with a comb-over and a permanent coffee stain on his tie. Today he looked even more flustered than usual, mopping his brow with a crumpled handkerchief as he motioned Maya into his glass-walled office. He didn't ask her to sit. He didn't say good morning. Instead, he slid a termination slip across his cluttered desk, his eyes fixed on a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame paperweight. "I'm sorry, Maya," Miller mumbled, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. "We have to let you go. Effective immediately." Maya stared at the paper, the words swimming before her tired eyes. "What? Why? I didn't do anything wrong. I was assaulted yesterday on the job, Mr. Miller. You know I'm a good worker." Miller finally looked up, and in his eyes, Maya saw not malice, but fear. "It came from downtown, Maya. City Hall. They said there was a complaint about you causing a public disturbance, endangering traffic, and damaging private property. They see you as a liability." He dropped his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, kid. I know it's garbage, but the name on the complaint, it's Vance. You can't fight that kind of money. Just take your last check and go before they make me call security." Maya walked out of the depot, the heavy metal gate clanging shut behind her with a finality that echoed in her hollow chest. She was jobless, injured, and facing a city that suddenly felt like a fortress built to keep her out. The walk back to her apartment was a blur of hot pavement and unshed tears. She lived in a converted warehouse on the edge of town, a place where more streetlights were broken than working, and the walls were thin enough to hear her neighbors cough. Her apartment was a single, ground-floor room, damp and smelling faintly of mildew, but it was hers. It was the only sanctuary she had. When she arrived, she found the front door unlocked, the deadbolt hanging loosely by a single screw. Panic flared in her chest. Had someone broken in? She rushed inside, dropping her bag, her eyes scanning the small space. Everything was as she'd left it. Her few pieces of furniture, her handful of books, the worn rug. The lock wasn't forced. It was just old. The rotten wood had finally given way to gravity and time. She sank onto her lumpy mattress, burying her face in her hands. It was just one thing too many: the job, the assault, the pain, and now she couldn't even lock her own door to keep the world out. She felt a cold nose nudge her elbow. It was Scout, the puppy. He was sitting by the bed, his tail giving a slight, tentative wag, offering the only comfort he could. A shadow fell across the open threshold, blocking the harsh midday light. Maya's head shot up, adrenaline surging, only to see a familiar silhouette. Jack Corrigan stood there, filling the doorway, dressed in a simple dark t-shirt and jeans, a tool bag slung over one shoulder. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a fortress. "Didn't mean to startle you," Jack said, his voice low and even. "I saw you leaving the depot early. You looked like you had the weight of the world on you, so I followed to make sure you got home safe." He stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the broken lock hanging from the doorframe. He didn't ask permission. He simply set his bag down and pulled out a cordless drill and a box of heavy-duty screws. Figured this place could use a little hardening. Landlords in this part of town aren't known for their speed. Maya watched him, too exhausted to protest. "I lost my job," she whispered, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. "Because of yesterday, they said I'm a liability." Jack paused, the drill in his hand silent for a moment. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek, but he didn't turn around. "It wasn't a liability, Maya. It was corruption, and it's temporary. I promise you that." He set to work, his movements efficient and precise. Within 10 minutes, he had not only repaired the lock but had reinforced the strike plate with longer screws that bit deep into the stud frame. He checked the window next, found it sticking, and lubricated the tracks until it slid smoothly, locking with a satisfying click. He was fixing the physical cracks in her world because he couldn't yet fix the ones in her life. But the gesture was not lost on her. Just as Jack was packing up his tools, a knock sounded on the newly repaired door. It wasn't a tentative knock. It was sharp, authoritative, 3 precise raps. Maya froze, looking at Jack. He gave her a reassuring nod and stepped back into a darker corner of the room, crossing his arms, making himself discreet but vigilant. Maya opened the door to find a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a luxury car commercial. He was tall, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a suit that cost more than Maya made in a year. He carried a leather briefcase and wore a smile that didn't reach his predatory blue eyes. "Ms. Diaz," the man purred, his voice as smooth as oiled silk. "I'm Arthur Harrison. I represent the Vance family. May I come in?" Maya hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him entry. Harrison entered the modest apartment, his nose twitching slightly at the smell of damp, though his smile remained fixed. He placed his briefcase on her small, scarred kitchen table and snapped open the latches. "I'm here to clear up the unfortunate misunderstanding that occurred yesterday," Harrison began, pulling out a thick document and a sleek checkbook. "Mr. Vance is a generous man. He understands that accidents happen, especially with careless pedestrians." Harrison uncapped a gold fountain pen and wrote on a check with a flourish. He tore it out and slid it across the table toward Maya. She looked down and felt her breath catch. It was for $10, more money than she had ever seen at one time. It could pay her rent for a year, buy her food, fix her life. "This is a gesture of goodwill," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "All we require is your signature on this non-disclosure agreement. It simply states that you acknowledge the incident was an accident caused by your own negligence in entering the roadway and that Caleb Vance was operating his vehicle responsibly. You sign, the money is yours, and we all move on. No police reports, no messy lawsuits that, frankly, a girl like you has no chance of winning." He smiled again, a shark-smelling blood. "Think of it as a fresh start, Maya. You're out of a job now, aren't you? This is a lifeline." The room was silent, save for the ticking of a cheap clock on the wall. Maya looked at the check, then at the document that would turn her into a liar and absolve a criminal. She thought of the puppy, trembling in the road. She thought of the bruises on her ribs. She thought of Mr. Miller's frightened eyes. $10,000. It was safety. It was food. But as she looked at Arthur Harrison's smug, expectant face, she realized it was also a collar. It was a price tag for her soul. A fire ignited in her chest. Hotter than the shame, hotter than the fear. Her hands, rough from years of manual labor, stopped trembling. She reached out, picked up the check, and held it up to the light. Harrison's smile widened, thinking he had won. Then, with a deliberate tear that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the small room, Maya ripped the check in half, then into quarters. She let the pieces flutter onto the table like confetti. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking not with fear, but with rage. "Get out of my house." Harrison's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard sneer. "You're making a mistake, Ms. Diaz," he hissed, slamming his briefcase shut. "You're picking a fight you can't win. We will bear you." "I said get out," Maya screamed, pointing at the door. Arthur Harrison turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Maya stood by the table, her chest heaving, the adrenaline making her legs weak. She felt like she might collapse, but strong hands gripped her shoulders. Jack stepped out of the shadows. He didn't say a word. He turned her to face him, and Maya looked up to see something profound in his slate-gray eyes. The pity was gone. The gentle concern was gone. In its place was a fierce, burning respect. He looked at her not as a victim to be saved, but as an equal to be honored. He had seen grown men, hardened soldiers, fold under less pressure than what she had just endured. She had refused a lifeline in exchange for her integrity, and in doing so, had proven she was made of iron. "You," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion, "are the bravest person I have met in a very long time." He squeezed her shoulders gently. "They just declared war, Maya, and I'm not going to let you fight it alone. I promise you, on my life, you're under my protection." The drive out of Cleveland was conducted in silence, a tactical retreat more than a flight. Jack drove his nondescript black pickup with the same focused calm he applied to everything, constantly checking his mirrors, not out of paranoia, but out of deeply ingrained habit. Maya sat in the passenger seat, Scout's head resting heavily in her lap, watching the concrete and steel of the city give way to the rolling green hills of rural Ohio. They were heading for a safe house owned by an old teammate of Jack's, a man nicknamed Gunner who had retired to the quiet life of a carpenter. Though Gunner was currently fishing in Montana, he had given Jack the code to the lockbox without a moment's hesitation. The cabin was a structure that reflected its owner, built of rough-hewn pine, solid, unpretentious, and isolated at the end of a long gravel road that snaked through a dense forest of oak and maple. It was a place where cell service was spotty, and the only surveillance cameras were the eyes of the hawks circling overhead. When they arrived, the silence of the woods seemed heavy compared to the constant roar of the city. But for Maya, it was the first time in days her shoulders had relaxed from their defensive posture. The cabin smelled of cedar and wood smoke, a grounding, masculine scent that seemed to envelop them as soon as they stepped through the door. 2 weeks passed in this remote haven, a period of time that felt like a suspended breath between two storms. The days settled into a rhythm that looked and felt like domesticity, a stark contrast to the violence that had brought them there. For Scout, the recovery was visible and swift. The German Shepherd puppy, which Jack had determined was about 4 months old, proved to have a constitution that matched his breed. The scrape on his flank scabbed and began to heal, the fur growing back in soft tufts. His ribs, once prominent, began to disappear under a healthy layer of muscle, thanks to a high-protein diet Jack prepared. But the most significant change was in the dog's demeanor. Initially skittish at loud noises and sudden movements, Scout began to mirror the calm confidence of the man who now shared his space, shadowing Jack everywhere from the woodpile to the kitchen, watching him with adoring eyes. It wasn't uncommon for Maya to wake in the morning and find Jack reading in an armchair with Scout asleep across his legs, a picture of peace that made her chest ache with an unfamiliar warmth. For Maya, the healing was slower, but no less profound. The bruises on her ribs faded from an angry purple to a dull yellow, and her limp disappeared. But it was her mental healing that Jack focused on. He didn't treat her like a fragile doll. He treated her like a recruit with potential. Their afternoons were spent training in the small clearing behind the cabin. "You're small," Jack told her one afternoon, his voice even and instructional as they stood in the grass. "That means you can't rely on strength. You have to rely on leverage and gravity." He taught her how to break a wrist grab, how to use her center of gravity to unbalance a larger opponent, and how to strike not with her fist, but with the heel of her hand. There was an intimacy to these lessons that transcended the physical mechanics of self-defense. When Jack corrected her stance, his hands were firm but respectful, his large frame shielding her rather than threatening her. Maya learned the texture of his hands, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when she successfully executed a move. They were two solitary souls, one scarred by the foster system and the cruelties of poverty, the other by war and the weight of duty, finding a common language in the quiet woods. Evenings were spent in the kitchen, a space that had become the heart of their temporary home. They cooked together, a dance of chopping and stirring that required little conversation. Jack, despite his lethal profession, cooked with a surprising delicacy, treating the ingredients with the same precision he applied to his equipment. Maya would sit at the counter peeling potatoes or washing vegetables, stealing glances at him. She learned that he took his coffee black, that he hummed softly when he thought no one was listening, and that he had a deep, rumbling laugh that he rarely used, but that lit up the room when it emerged. One evening, as they were cleaning up after a meal, their hands brushed as they both reached for a dish towel. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt that made them both freeze. They stood there for a long moment, the silence of the cabin amplified, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Jack didn't pull his hand away immediately, and Maya didn't want him to. In that brief connection, the boundaries of protector and protected began to blur, replaced by the magnetic pull of a man and a woman who had recognized a kindred spirit. The fragility of their peace was tested on the 15th night. A summer thunderstorm rolled in over the hills, sudden and violent. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind whipped the trees into a frenzy. When the first clap of thunder cracked directly overhead, it sounded like a bomb, rattling the window panes in their frames. Maya, who had been reading on the sofa, dropped her book and curled into a tight ball, her hands flying up to cover her ears. The sound transported her instantly back to the Cleveland sidewalk, the thunder merging with the memory of the sports car's engine and Caleb's shouting voice. She was no longer in the cabin. She was back on the pavement, helpless and surrounded. She trembled so hard her teeth chattered, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Scout, sensing her distress, whimpered and nudged her hand, but she was too lost in the flashback to respond. Jack had been checking the security latches when the storm hit. He saw her reaction and was across the room in 3 long strides. He didn't ask what was wrong. He knew. He sat down on the floor beside the sofa, bringing himself to her level. He didn't grab her. He simply created a presence, a solid wall between her and the storm. "Maya," he said, his voice pitched low, under the roar of the rain. "You're safe. Look at me. You're here." When the next thunderclap boomed, Maya let out an involuntary sob and listed toward him. Jack opened his arms and she fell into them, burying her face in the solid warmth of his chest. He held her tightly, his chin resting on the top of her head. He could feel her frantic, rabbit-like heartbeat against his own steady one. He rocked her gently, a primal, soothing motion. "I've got you," he whispered into her hair. "I've got you. Nothing is getting in here." They stayed like that for a long time, long after the thunder had faded and the rain had settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. The physical barrier between them had completely dissolved. Maya breathed in his scent, a mixture of wood smoke, rain, and clean cotton, and felt the terror recede, replaced by a profound sense of safety she had never known in her life. She realized with stunning clarity that she didn't just feel safe because he was a soldier. She felt safe because he was Jack. And Jack, holding this brave, broken woman in his arms, realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't just completing a mission. He was holding his future. He shifted slightly, and Maya pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but clear. She didn't say, "Thank you." The words seemed too small. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, her grip tight, an anchor in the storm. Jack squeezed back, his large hand enveloping hers, a silent vow made in the dim light of the cabin. There were no kisses, no grand declarations of love, just 2 hands clasped as the rain washed the world clean outside, sealing a bond stronger than any steel he had ever used. The fragile peace of their woodland sanctuary was shattered not by a physical intruder, but by the vibration of a cell phone on the rough-hewn pine coffee table. It was late afternoon, the golden hour light filtering through the trees, casting long, serene shadows on the floor where Maya and Scout were engaged in a quiet game of tug-of-war. Jack was in the kitchen sharpening a knife with rhythmic, meditative strokes when the phone buzzed. It was a burner phone, one he activated only for emergencies, the number known to only a select few. He picked it up, his movements casual, but as he read the incoming text, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't say a word, but Scout, sensitive to the shift in his alpha's energy, stopped playing and sat up, his ears pricked forward. Maya looked up, her smile fading as she saw the look on Jack's face. It was the face of the warrior she had seen on the street in Cleveland. The face of a man who had just identified a target. "What is it?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. Jack didn't answer immediately. He walked over to her and held out the phone. On the small screen was a series of grainy photographs. The first showed her apartment door kicked in, the wood splintered and hanging from a hinge. The second showed the interior, her modest belongings vandalized, paint thrown on the walls, her mattress slashed. But it was the third photo that made Maya gasp and bring a hand to her mouth. It was a picture of her scooter, her trusty old Vespa, her only mode of transport and the symbol of her hard-won independence, engulfed in flames in the alley behind her building. Beneath the images was a single line of text. "Come out and play, trash girl, or the mud is next." Maya dropped the phone on the sofa as if it were burning, tears springing to her eyes. "They burned it," she whispered, the violation hurting more than the material loss. That was how I got to work. It was mine." She looked at Jack, panic rising in her chest. "How did they get your number? How did they know?" Jack knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. His grip was firm, grounding her. "They don't know where we are," he said, his voice low with absolute certainty. "They're lashing out because they can't find you. They're trying to smoke you out. It's a standard intimidation tactic used by cowards." He stood and began to pace the small room, not with nervous energy, but with the predatory intensity of a wolf planning a hunt. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice hard. "I thought if we disappeared, they'd get bored and move on to the next victim. I underestimated their ego. Caleb Vance isn't just a spoiled kid. He's a predator who can't stand being told no. If we don't end this now, he will hunt you forever. He stopped and looked at Maya. I'm going to end this, Maya, but I need you to trust me. We're not running anymore. We're going on the offensive. Jack retrieved a laptop from his duffel bag and sat at the kitchen table. He wasn't going to use force. Not yet. He was going to use information warfare, a battlefield he knew as well as any physical one. He dialed a number on an encrypted app. The voice on the other end answered on the first ring. Talk, said a voice that sounded like gravel grinding under a truck tire. This was Marcus, a former naval intelligence officer who now operated in the gray areas of private security and information brokerage. Marcus was a man who lived in the shadows with a mind like a steel trap and a cynicism to match Jack's. I need a favor, Marcus, Jack said, skipping the pleasantries. I need you to plant a story deep in the local rumor mills, the ones the rich kids in Cleveland follow. I need a rumor to start that Maya Diaz, the woman from the incident with Caleb Vance, was wearing a body cam. Tell them she has a memory card with high-def footage of the assault. Jack paused, his eyes narrowing. And Marcus, add a detail. Say the footage clearly shows Caleb sniffing cocaine in the driver's seat right before he hit the gas. Make sure that specific detail is hammered home. Marcus chuckled on the other end, a dry, humorless sound. The drug detail. Smart. Vance Sr. is pushing a clean city initiative for his new development contracts. If his son gets caught on film doing blow, the old man will cut him off. You're hitting him in the wallet. Exactly, Jack said. Spread it. Make him believe it exists. Make him believe I have it. The trap was set. For the next 12 hours, the rumor ripped through the digital networks of Cleveland's young and wealthy like a virus. It appeared in encrypted group chats, was whispered at country club bars, and finally, inevitably, reached the ears of Caleb Vance. Jack monitored the chatter through Marcus, waiting for the panic to set in. He knew men like Caleb. They didn't fear the police. They had lawyers for that. They didn't fear violence. They had bodyguards for that. They feared consequences. They feared the loss of status, of their allowance, of their inheritance. By fabricating the drug detail, Jack had created a threat that no lawyer could fix. If that video went public, or worse, if it was sent to his father, Caleb's life of luxury was over. The psychological pressure cooked Caleb slowly, turning his arrogance into desperation. He couldn't go to the police about a blackmail tape that proved his own crimes, and he couldn't tell his father. He was cornered. 2 days after the vandalism, Jack decided the temperature was just right. He sent a direct text message to Caleb's personal number, which Marcus had acquired with frightening ease. The message was simple, cold, and emotionless. I have the memory card. I know what's on it. Your father doesn't. Yet. He waited 5 minutes, letting the sweat bead on Caleb's forehead wherever he was reading it. Then he sent the second part. I want to make an exchange. The original memory card for the $10,000 in cash you tried to bribe Maya with. No copies. We walk away. You keep your trust fund. Then came the coordinates. Tonight, midnight. The old scrapyard on Industrial Road. Come alone. If I see a cop, a lawyer, or anyone who looks official, the video gets sent to your father's inbox before you can blink. Don't test me. It was a classic piece of bait. By asking for the money, Jack made the deal seem transactional, believable. He gave Caleb an out that his ego could accept, paying to make a problem go away. But Jack knew Caleb. He knew a bully wouldn't come alone to pay. He would come to take. Caleb would see this as a chance to crush the people who had humiliated him and destroy the evidence with his own hands. Caleb Vance paced the floor of his penthouse apartment, his phone clutched in his hand. He was trembling from a mixture of cocaine residue and abject terror. The rumor was real. They had him. He could see his father's face, the cold disappointment that always preceded a financial cutoff. He couldn't let it happen. He looked at the message again. The scrapyard. It was perfect, isolated, dark, lawless. He wasn't going to pay them a dime. He was going to take the memory card. He was going to teach the trash girl and her soldier boyfriend a lesson they wouldn't survive. And he was going to burn the evidence just like he'd burned that scooter. He started making calls, not to his lawyer, but to the contacts he kept for nights when he wanted to feel dangerous. He called Chad and the others, and he called a couple of hired muscles, guys from the docks who didn't ask questions as long as the cash was paid up front. Get your bats, Caleb ordered, his voice shaky with a drug-fueled, manic confidence. We're going hunting. He had no idea he was walking straight into a kill zone designed by a man who had hunted real monsters in places Caleb couldn't even find on a map. The industrial graveyard known as the Cuyahoga River Scrapyard sat on the forgotten edge of the city. A sprawling labyrinth of rusted metal car bodies and machinery piled high like the skeletal remains of a forgotten civilization under a pale crescent moon. The air here was thick with the smell of oxidized iron, old grease, and the damp earth of the riverbank that bordered the edge of the property. It was a place of shadows and silence, the kind of environment where secrets were buried. But tonight, it was a stage set for a lesson in consequences. Jack Corrigan had arrived 2 hours before the scheduled meet, moving through the maze of crushed sedans and gutted buses with the silent familiarity of a phantom. He didn't see a chaotic junk pile. He saw firing lanes, choke points, and tactical advantages. He had chosen this location specifically because it was a terrain that favored the disciplined over the numerous. In the center of the yard was a clearing surrounded by towering walls of compressed scrap metal, a natural arena with no easy exits. Jack moved with a chilling efficiency, his hands working quickly in the dark to manipulate the environment to his will. He wasn't setting lethal traps. That wasn't his mission. But he was laying a psychological minefield designed to disorient, confuse, and terrify. He used high-intensity strobe lights he had taken from his tactical kit, placing them at eye level in key corners, rigged to remote triggers. He set up audio decoys using car horns and salvageable batteries, wiring them to create a jarring cacophony from multiple directions at the push of a button. This was not going to be a brawl. It was going to be a surgical operation, and the scrapyard was his operating room. High above the clearing, perched atop a stack of 3 crushed shipping containers, was the rusted-out control cabin of a defunct crane. It was the highest point in the yard, accessible only by a narrow metal ladder that Jack had tested for stability. Inside this steel nest, Maya Diaz sat on the floor, her back against the wall with Scout curled at her side. The puppy was alert, his ears swiveling to catch the sounds of Jack moving below, but he remained silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. Jack had brought them up here first, securing them before he began his preparations. "Stay low," he had told her, his voice calm and devoid of fear. He had handed her a heavy-duty tactical flashlight and a small radio. "Do not come down, no matter what you hear. You're my eyes in the tower, Maya. If anyone tries a flanking move from the rear, you signal me with the light. Otherwise, stay hidden. Scout will stay with you." Maya had nodded, gripping the flashlight until her knuckles were white. Watching him then, dressed in dark tactical gear with his face painted in shadow, she realized she had never truly seen him before. The gentle man who cooked her stew and fixed her window was gone. In his place was a creature of absolute focus, a man who had walked through fires she couldn't imagine. She wasn't afraid of him, but she was awed by the sheer scale of his capability. From her vantage point, she watched him melt into the darkness below, becoming one with the night. The silence of the yard was broken at exactly midnight by the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. Headlights swept across the rusted metal walls, creating long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping fingers. 2 vehicles rolled into the main entrance. Caleb's flashy red sports car looked absurdly out of place among the wreckage, followed closely by a battered black cargo van. They parked in the center of the clearing, their engines idling for a moment before cutting out, plunging the yard back into a muted darkness. Car doors opened and the silence was broken by the loud, arrogant voices of men who believed they held all the cards. Caleb Vance stepped out first, looking jittery and manic. He was dressed in designer jeans and a leather jacket that cost more than Maya's entire wardrobe, a baseball bat clutched in his hand. He was sweating despite the cool night air, his eyes darting around the clearing, fueled by adrenaline and the lingering effects of his chemical habits. "Come on out," he yelled, his voice cracking slightly. "I know you're here. Bring me the memory card, soldier boy." Following him were the usual sycophants. Chad and the other friend, both looking pale and nervous, holding lengths of pipe they clearly had no idea how to use. But from the back of the van emerged the real threat. 3 men stepped out who looked like they were carved from granite and bad decisions. These were the hired muscles, dock workers paid to break legs and ask no questions. The leader of this trio was a man who could only be described as a human bulldozer. He was bald with a thick neck that merged directly into his shoulders and arms covered in faded prison tattoos. He held a loose tire iron in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. Jack watched them from a concealed position behind the engine block of a dismantled truck 30 feet away. He assessed the threat level in a single heartbeat. 6 hostiles, 3 amateurs, 3 semi-pros. No visible firearms yet, but he assumed Caleb might be hiding something. The odds were 6-1, an equation Caleb surely thought guaranteed his victory. Jack felt his own heart rate slow, a physiological response conditioned by years of training. He breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth, centering himself. He made one last check of his gear. No lethal weapons, just his hands, his boots, and the environment he had weaponized. He watched as Caleb paced the center of the clearing, growing more agitated. "I'm not playing games," Caleb shouted, swinging the bat into a piece of scrap metal with a loud clang. "You want your money? Come and get it. Or are you hiding behind your girlfriend's skirt?" The hired muscle, the bald man, spat on the ground and chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "He's not coming, kid," he rumbled. "He saw us and ran. Smart." They were relaxed, confident, off guard. They were standing in a group, their backs to the shadows, their eyes unable to penetrate the darkness beyond the reach of their headlights. They thought they were the hunters, the apex predators in a concrete jungle. They had no idea they had just stepped into the den of a wolf who had hunted in the wildest places on Earth. High in the crane cabin, Maya watched through the grimy glass, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the weapons, the size of the men, and the manic fury in Caleb's posture. Fear threatened to paralyze her, urging her to close her eyes and hide. But then she looked down at Scout. The puppy was sitting at attention, his gaze fixed on the spot where Jack was hidden. He wasn't trembling. He was waiting. Maya took a deep breath, drawing strength from the dog and from the memory of Jack's calm voice. "You're my eyes in the tower," she told herself. She gripped the flashlight, her thumb resting on the button. She swept her gaze across the perimeter of the clearing, watching the back of the van, watching the shadows behind the men. She would not be a victim tonight. She was part of the team. Below, Caleb's patience snapped completely. "Find them!" he screamed, pointing wildly at the surrounding scrap heaps. "Tear this place apart. Find the girl, get the cart, and break his hands." The bald man motioned to his two cronies, and they began to spread out, moving toward the perimeter of the clearing. They crossed the invisible line Jack had marked in his mind. The trap was set. The prey was in the kill zone. Jack's hand tightened on the remote trigger in his pocket. The waiting was over. The trap was sprung, not with a shout, but with a sudden, suffocating absence of light. As the hired muscle stepped deeper into the heart of the clearing, passing the carcass of an old city bus, Jack Walker flipped the master switch on the remote detonator he held in his gloved hand. The high-powered work lights he had pre-rigged, which had been supplying a dim, comforting hum of electricity, went dead instantly. Simultaneously, a secondary charge blew the fuses on the portable headlights the goons had brought with them. The scrapyard plunged into an absolute, disorienting darkness, the kind that throws off the inner ear and makes the air feel thick. The moon, previously a comforting sliver, was now completely obscured by the towering walls of scrap metal, leaving Caleb and his men functionally blind. Before their eyes could even begin to adjust, the sonic assault began. The car horns Jack had wired to car batteries at the four corners of the yard erupted in a deafening symphony of noise. A rhythmic, discordant blare that made communication impossible and destroyed any sense of direction. Jack moved. He slipped his night vision goggles down from his forehead, the world instantly shifting from inky black to a crisp, monochrome phosphorescent green. To him, the confusion of the men in the clearing was pitifully clear. The three hired thugs were spinning in place, swinging their tire irons at ghosts, while Caleb and his college buddies were huddled near the red sports car, screaming words that were swallowed by the horns. Jack dropped from his perch on the truck engine, his boots making no sound as they hit the dirt. He moved with the predatory grace of a panther, weaving through the scrap metal. He approached his first target, the bald leader, who was screaming orders into the void. Jack didn't need to hurt him badly. He just needed to neutralize him. He came up behind the man, tapped him on the shoulder to make him turn, and as he swung wildly to his right, Jack swept his legs out from under him. The man hit the ground with a heavy thud. The wind was knocked out of him. Before he could inhale, Jack had a chokehold applied, compressing the carotid arteries with precise pressure. 6 seconds later, the man was unconscious, and Jack laid him gently on the ground, binding his hands with a zip tie. One down. The disappearance of their leader, coupled with the relentless noise, sent the remaining two hired muscles into a panic. They moved back to back, swinging their iron pipes in wide, dangerous arcs. Jack watched them through the green glow of his optics, biding his time. He needed a distraction. High in the crane tower, Maya Diaz was watching the chaos unfold. She couldn't see details in the darkness, but she saw the wild flashes from the men's cell phone flashlights dancing like fireflies in a jar. Then she saw a movement the men did not. A figure detached from the shadows to her left, moving toward Jack's blind spot. One of Caleb's friends, Chad, had stumbled away from the car and was unknowingly flanking Jack, a heavy wrench in his hand. Maya didn't hesitate. She aimed the high-powered tactical flashlight Jack had given her and hit the switch. A blinding beam of white light, focused and intense, cut through the darkness like a laser, hitting Chad squarely in the face. He screamed, dropping the wrench and throwing his hands up to his eyes. Utterly blinded by the sudden flood of light. Jack saw the beam and understood instantly. He used the distraction to close the distance on the two remaining thugs. He moved low, striking the first in the solar plexus and the second with a leg sweep. It was a blur of kinetic energy, efficient and brutal in its simplicity. Within 10 seconds, both men were on the ground, groaning and being secured with zip ties. The silence fell as suddenly as the noise had begun. Jack cut the car horns with his remote. The abrupt quiet was even more terrifying than the noise had been. Caleb Vance stood alone by his car, his friends cowering on the ground, his hired protection neutralized. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving. "Where are you?" Caleb shrieked, his voice breaking, tears of terror and drug-induced paranoia streaming down his face. "Show yourself. I'll kill you." Jack stepped into the periphery of the moonlight, slipping his night vision goggles off. He was just a silhouette, a dark shape made of judgment and consequence. "It's over, Caleb," Jack said, his voice calm, echoing slightly off the metal walls. "You have no one left. Put your hands on your head and get on your knees." But Caleb was past the point of reason. The humiliation, the fear, and the drugs had created a fracture in reality. He fumbled at his waistband, his hands shaking violently, and pulled out a short-barreled revolver, a cheap, illegal gun he'd bought to feel powerful. "No!" Caleb screamed, raising the gun with a trembling hand, pointing it wildly in Jack's direction. "You don't win. My father wins. I win." Jack froze. He was 20 feet away, too far to close the distance before Caleb could pull the trigger. He shifted his weight, preparing to lunge, but he knew the physics were against him. A shot at this range, even from a shaky hand, was a coin toss with death. But Caleb had forgotten one variable. He had forgotten the eyes that had been watching him from the shadows of the crane tower stairway. Scout, the German shepherd, had not remained in the cabin. Sensing the immense threat to the man who had healed him, the dog had crept down the metal stairs and was crouched under a rusted-out sedan, his muscles coiled like steel springs. When the gun appeared, instinct took over. No command was given, no training cue was used. Only the ancient pact between dog and man. Scout launched out of the darkness, a blur of black and tan, fur moving faster than thought. He didn't aim for the throat. He aimed for the threat. Scout's jaws clamped down on Caleb's right wrist, teeth sinking deep. Caleb screamed, a sound of pure agony, and the gun flew from his hand, skittering uselessly on the gravel. The force of the impact knocked him backward onto the ground. Scout released him instantly at Jack's sharp command. "Scout, out!" And stood over the fallen man, a low growl rumbling in his chest, a guardian demon with bared teeth. Jack was on Caleb in a second. He kicked the gun away and flipped Caleb onto his stomach, wrenching his arms behind his back. The zip tie pulled tight, the sound of the plastic locking mechanism signaling the end of a family's reign of terror. Caleb was sobbing now, clutching his bleeding wrist, all his bravado dissolved into the pathetic whimpers of a child finally being told no. Jack stood up, his breathing even, and looked down at the dog. Scout looked back, his tail giving a slight, tentative wag, looking for approval. Jack knelt and buried his hands in the dog's thick ruff, resting his forehead against the animal's for a brief moment. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, buddy." Maya came running from the crane tower, her flashlight beam bouncing. She slowed as she approached, taking in the bodies on the ground, the gun in the dirt, and finally, Jack and Scout, safe. She dropped the flashlight and ran to them, throwing her arms around Jack's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Jack hugged her tightly with one arm, his other hand still resting on Scout. They stood there in the center of the scrap yard, surrounded by the wreckage of the fight. 3 survivors who had faced the darkness and won. The flashing lights of approaching sirens began to paint the metal walls in a rhythmic pulse, red and blue, red and blue. But this time, Jack had called the right people. The flashing red and blue lights that flooded the scrap yard were accompanied by the sharp, authoritative siren that signaled a different kind of law enforcement. These were not the lumbering patrol cars of the local precinct, but the sleek, powerful interceptors of the Ohio State Highway Patrol. Jack had bypassed the local chain of command entirely, contacting a liaison in the state police he had worked with on a previous joint task force. From the lead car stepped Trooper Davis, a man whose uniform was pressed to a razor's edge and whose wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over eyes that missed nothing. He was a cop's cop, a man who ate regulations for breakfast and despised corruption. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance, noting the bound thugs, the crying rich kid, the illegal firearm lying in the dirt, and the Navy SEAL standing calmly with his hands visible. Jack approached him, not as a suspect, but as a colleague. "Chief Corrigan," Davis said with a nod of acknowledgement, "looks like you had a busy night." Jack handed him a small digital recorder. Aggravated assault, kidnapping, attempted murder, and illegal firearm possession. Jack listed the charges with the precision of a court clerk. "And you'll find a confession on here. He admits to the prior assault and the vandalism." Caleb Vance was hauled to his feet, his protests about his father's influence dying in his throat as the cold steel cuffs of the state police snapped around his wrists. When he tried to scream at Maya, Trooper Davis simply shut the patrol car door, sealing him in a soundproof cage of his own making. The corrupt officer Russo, who had arrived late on the scene to try and run damage control, was met by two internal affairs officers, who collected his badge and weapon on the spot. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. Autumn came to Cleveland, painting the trees in public square with strokes of gold and crimson. The air was crisp, no longer heavy with the oppressive heat of that fateful August afternoon. On a quiet corner of a revitalized neighborhood, a new sign hung above a freshly painted storefront that read, "Scouts Haven, Grooming, and Supplies." Inside, the air smelled of lavender shampoo and clean dog fur. Maya Diaz stood behind the counter, but she was no longer the invisible girl in a gray uniform. She wore a bright apron, her hair was down and shining, and her face was lit with a purpose that went far beyond mere survival. The civil settlement from the Vance family, paid quickly to avoid a public trial that would have destroyed their real estate empire, had been substantial. Maya hadn't bought a sports car or a mansion. She had bought her dream. Scout, now grown into a magnificent German shepherd with a coat of sable and black, lay on a mat by the door, greeting customers with a friendly wag of his tail. He was a local celebrity, the dog who had faced down a gun and won. Maya moved through the shop with a lightness in her step, arranging organic treats and greeting her regulars by name. She had built a life from the ashes of her old one, a life defined not by what she had lost, but by what she had saved. The loudspeaker announcement at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport was a garbled string of flight numbers, but to Maya, it sounded like a countdown. She stood near the security checkpoint, her hand resting on Scout's head, who was permitted here as a service animal in training, a designation Jack had helped arrange. Jack stood before her, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He was in uniform, his Desert Marpat fatigues, his boots polished, the American flag patch on his shoulder a reminder of the duty that called him away. His leave was over. The world needed its sheepdogs, and he had to return to the flock. The sadness in Maya's eyes was tempered by an intense pride. She didn't cling to him. She stood tall, mirroring the strength he had taught her. "You hold down the fort," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to suppress. "And take care of our boy." Maya nodded, unable to trust her voice. Jack reached up and unclasped the chain from around his neck. The two metal dog tags clinked softly, a sound like tiny bells. He took her hand and placed the warm metal in her palm, closing her fingers around them. "Hold these for me," he said, his gray eyes locking on hers with an intensity that made the busy terminal fade away. "I'm coming back for them. That's a promise." Maya looked down at the tags, then back up at him, the tears finally coming, not of despair, but of hope. "I'll be here," she whispered. "We'll be here." He kissed her on the forehead, a long, protective gesture, gave Scout one last scratch behind the ears, and turned to walk through the security gate. He didn't look back, because soldiers don't look back. They move forward. Maya and Scout watched him until his broad shoulders disappeared into the crowd, standing together as a testament to the instinct that had brought them all together. The instinct to protect, to love, and to survive.